In this section, we're going to talk about Lecture 2, Rise of Europe. We're going to talk about the Age of Exploration. We're going to focus on some very specific things that get us to colonial America. It's where we want to end up. So the first guy we want to talk about is Prince Henry the Navigator, and giving us, there's millions of things you talk about, but giving us the colonial American history. We want to talk about Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry was a Portuguese prince living in the late 1300s, early 1400s, and he had an interest in seamanship and sailing the ocean blue and navigation. He's wealthy enough he can start a navigation school for sailors, bringing together all the knowledge of the known world at the time, like perfecting instruments, studying maps, developing map making skills, kind of bring together kind of all the knowledge in the world to kind of develop the different cultures in the Mediterranean's understanding of seamanship. As part of his naval school, he was wealthy enough to not only set up this naval school, but what the naval school would do is they would set up voyages every year, these yearly voyages that would, make use of new technology, see what works, kind of exploring the world a little bit, to kind of bring new knowledge to at least Europeans' understanding of navigation in the world. Well, where does Portugal sit? Portugal sits just north of Africa, and so you're going to have these Portuguese voyages down the coast of West Africa. In 1445, we see the first Feitoria. Feitoria is a fortified trading post on the African coast. In 1482, by 1482, we had the first Feitoria on Africa's Gold Coast, and what that is if you know your geography of Africa, there's Portugal, there's the Mediterranean, right? And then Africa kind of bulges out to the west quite a ways, and then kind of comes back. So the Gold Coast is that bottom part of Africa after the hump, and then before it goes south even farther. And so we see that. These first Feitorias, since these first Portuguese forts are not well armed or well protected, generally required African participation and consent of the different African cultures who lived in the along the Gold Coast, such as the Ashanti, the Kingdom of Benin, and the Kingdom of Ghana. And they they employed Africans and even paid rent to local rulers, because the balance in power is kind of shifted towards these African cultures that they live there. Okay. And the next thing we got to get to is freedom and slavery in Africa. Freedom and slavery in Africa. And so, for U.S. history, we want to focus on West Africa. Slavery existed. Slavery's existed since the beginning of agriculture. The second that human beings found out that farming was hard, they wanted somebody else to do it. But for Africa, you have during the centuries that we're talking about. You have the Arab slave trade in East Africa. And for West Africa, though, for U.S. history, we want to focus on slavery in West Africa. In West Africa, you have various African kingdoms or chiefdoms, Ghana, the Ashanti, Benin, who compete with each other for, the resources, control, the trade of the region. Often, what these tribes would do is, just like in general in world history, traditionally the way you became a slave was you lost a war. And so for prisoners of war and conflicts, you have these African tribes competing with each other. And this is where we start to see Africans being sold to Europeans, these first Portuguese Vitórias in West Africa. And so what develops from that is the Atlantic slave trade. And so we'll be going over the Atlantic slave trade in another lecture specifically, but what we need to get from here is kind of the beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade. You have Portuguese Vitórias and traders along the coast of the Gold Coast of West Africa. Initially, you have African tribes selling POWs to Europeans. Eventually, it will become Europeans going inland and getting slaves on their own. When you study the primary documents, 1441 is generally considered the first sub-Saharan African forced labor slaves in Europe in modern times, meaning, post-Roman Empire. And so those kind of the beginnings of that period. And so we're going to leave that there. We'll come back to it. It'll be the 1600s. So the 1440s to the early 1600s. So we're going to leave it for about 200 years and see how it develops. Next, obviously, with the Age of Exploration, probably the biggest figure would be Christopher Columbus. So there's a lot about him in popular history. Columbus's early life. What's kind of interesting, this is a lesson for you about history. Columbus, one of the most famous people in world history, right? Historians don't actually know his birth date. Historians think we think he was born about 1451. But that's kind of a lesson in how it's studying history, the need for the primary documents, the written records. We actually don't know when he was born, about 1451. Generally born in Genoa, Italy. I did see a YouTube video this last year about Columbus actually being born in Portugal. So there you have that. If you want to look that video up, you can. Or if you want to email me, I can try to find it for you. But Columbus is generally considered to have been born in Italy, in Genoa, to a Italian merchant family. But I will tell you there's other ideas out there. Coming from a merchant class family, this is another lesson about studying history. We generally only think of people when they're famous. And so we don't really when Columbus is famous in world history, he's already in his 50s. I mean, he's like 1450 to 1492. The guy's 50 almost, right? I'm not a math major, and so this is another interesting aspect. We kind of think of these historical figures as just being born famous. And so we kind of lose sight of, by the time Columbus was sailing the ocean blue in 1492, he'd already he'd been a seaman for decades. There's evidence he sailed, there's some historians that think, based on the documents, he may have sailed to Iceland, all over the Mediterranean, England, everywhere. Columbus did go to the navigational school, Prince Henry's Navigational School, and study. And during this time period, this is where he comes up with his theories. Columbus's theory is that the Earth, the planet Earth, is only about 7,000 miles around. And so, rather than, if you want to trade with China and the East Indies, rather than, going through, Muslim people that hate us and around the coast of Africa, which is a 6-month voyage, let's sail west around the globe uh, to get to China and the East Indies. And so that's his theory. And then you probably know the popular story. He's going around the courts of Europe trying to sell his idea. I need funding for a voyage. I want to sell west to get to Asia. It'll be cheaper. It'll be shorter to do that. Columbus and the Royal Accords. And this is where I need to help kind of explode the myth for you. In the last video, I told you ancient Greeks and Romans thought the world was round. We can't say they knew the world was round because they never sailed around it, or they couldn't prove definitively the world was round because they never traveled around it. But they thought the world was round. Ancient Greek philosophers and scientists argued that the world was about 24,000 miles around using our measurements. They didn't have miles, but using our measurements is around 24,000 miles around. So what does this tell you? Remember, we said this. Medieval Europeans are studying ancient Greek and Romans. So medieval Europeans think the world is round too. And so that's kind of your first big myth about Columbus. The argument between Columbus and the royal courts of Europe is not whether the earth is flat or not. Everyone in the room thinks the world's round. Okay? Everyone thinks the world's round. That's not the argument. The argument is the size of the world and why these royal courts in Europe while these royal scientists are laughing at Columbus is they think what the ancient Greeks think, that the world's about 24,000 miles around. Columbus is saying, no, it's only 7,000, And what's kind of funny is, in a weird way, Columbus was right. Because Columbus was saying, hey, there's land. There's land only about 2,000 miles, our measurement, only 2,000 miles away. Guess what? There is land around 2,000 miles away from Portugal. There is. It's just not Asia. What is it? It's the island of Hispaniola. It's the Bahamas. It's Cuba, Hispaniola. It's the islands of the Caribbean. And so what's kind of funny about Columbus is, in a weird way, he was right because that's what he was arguing. Asia is only about 2,000 miles to the west. And so, so in October 1492, when Columbus hits the island of Hispaniola, that's why he thinks he said Asia, because in his wrong theory is actually correct in that there is land. There is land about 2,000 miles away from Portugal. It's the Caribbean. It's the island of Hispaniola. And so we kind of all know the story from popular history. That's why they're called Los Indios, because, he knows he said Asia. Why they're called Indians, Europeans and 15th century Europeans know what Asians look like and know what Indians look like. So they know somebody that's Chinese looks a certain way and somebody that's Indian from India or the Indies, West or East Indies, look a certain way. And so when Columbus hits the Caribbean and he sees these people, they, from his point of view, they look like Indians, people from India. So he calls them Los Indios. And so he's familiar. So he's asking, where China is. He's asking where China is. And so you have that. 5 voyages by 1492 to 1499. Columbus will die thinking he's hit Asia. By the time he dies in 1506, though, people in Europe are pretty sure he has it in Asia. 1519 is the first time we see a map. A guy named Amerigo Vespucci draws a map of what's known of the Western Hemisphere in 1519, and that's where we get that. The Columbian Exchange is this idea of globalization. What's interesting is when we say globalization, you might be tempted to think of only the modern era, 20th century. This idea of globalization, the Columbian Exchange is within 100 years of Columbus people are traveling the world. There's Asians everywhere, there's Africans everywhere, there's Europeans everywhere. You can buy Native American goods in various parts of the world. You can buy Chinese goods, European goods, in all parts of the world. And so I would encourage you as a student of history to, we don't look at globalization as just a modern phenomenon. Okay. Globalization's, going all the way back.